Coming up next is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, where Patrick and I discuss 3 terabyte hard drives, fanless power supplies, and AMD bulldozers.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twitch.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 84, recorded August 26th, 2010. Factory overclocked 3 terabyte fanless wiring. Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware. I'm Ryan Shrout, joined by Patrick Norton. Hello, Patrick.
Hey, man. How's it going?
Doing pretty well. I hear you're having a little bit of a heat wave out in San Francisco, though.
It's for San Francisco, 85 degrees is awe-inspiring. Over on the East Bay, on the other side of the bay where I live now, it was 103, 107, depending on where you were, which meant all of the fans and all of the notebooks were basically running 24/7 in my house.
That's unusually hot for you guys. We hadn't breached 100, I don't think, maybe once or twice this year. But there is something else interesting going on your way. I don't know if you'd heard about hot chips.
I had never actually heard of hot chips. I thought I knew about all of the different software, hardware, chip gatherings. And then somebody's like, oh, dude, you hear what AMD announced at Hot Chips? And I was like, hot chips, ? WTF is hot chips, to be all sophisticated.
Hot Chips is less of a conference and more, or less of a show and more of a conference where all the really geeky information comes out about architectures and hardware and this type of thing. Probably the biggest news, it's held in Stanford, at Stanford University for one thing. So you kind of know what kind of crowd you're going to get there, right? So it's the engineers, it's the architects that are coming there to present what they think is going to happen. And a lot of times these companies kind of reveal first bits of architectures also while they do that. And AMD took the opportunity to do this year at the Hot Chips. It just passed us this past weekend, and they talked about their upcoming architecture called Bulldozer. They talked about something called Bulldozer and Bobcat. And we don't want to talk about get in too much detail, but both of these designs, Bulldozer and Bobcat, obviously they're going based on construction material here, and also based on the name. You can say the Bulldozer is the big consumer desktop client-based architecture. The Bobcat is a little one for mobile devices and things like that. Very clever, aren't they?
Are they all about the B names for their processors now?
I don't know.
Is Bulldozer is that designed to compete with Core i7 or something more mid-priced from Intel?
So Bulldozer they really haven't said exactly what it's going to compete with, because it all depends on how fast they can get it to clock up. But it is a new architecture, a high-performance computing architecture meant to compete against Nehalem and Sandy Bridge. So it is aimed at Core i7. It is aimed at enthusiasts and mainstream. It's going to cover a large area of the desktop market. And what's interesting here is that this is the first really dramatic shift from in an architectural standpoint. It's the first ground up redesign that AMD's had since the introduction essentially of the Opteron and the Athlon processors, which was back in 2001, I think October 2001, if I'm guessing correct, maybe October 2002. So it's been a long time
ago in any case. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the main feature that they're doing here is obviously they're improving instructions per clock. They're improving a lot of the technology, but the most, I would say, interesting thing that they're getting into is they're bringing up a competitor to hyperthreading. So this is hyperthreading. We know is the ability to run 2 threads on a single core that Intel introduced a long time ago in Pentium 4 and then reintroduced with Nehalem. And AMD's never really had anything like that. So what they had to do was kind of compete on core process, the actual number of physical cores that they had, physical number of cores in competition with price and all those types of things. They went a little bit different route here. Hyperthreading, to sum it up in as easy a way as we can, basically is you're using the exact same hardware stream, but you're swapping between 2 threads. What AMD is going to do is they're going to have 2 threads per core, but each thread has some dedicated resources and some shared resources. So it's a little bit different than what Intel has done. It means it's going to cost a little bit more in terms of die size, and transistor count and that kind of stuff. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another type of issue is they're expanding the clock rates on it. We were expecting to see 3.5 up to 4 gigahertz clock speeds on this processor, although they haven't really announced something. That's something that we're just kind of guessing at this point. We want we want this to be out as soon as possible. We want it to be good because Intel hasn't had any competition with the Athlon and the Phenom brands in quite a long time.
At least not as much as we would like.
Yes. Yes, and we need AMD to have a part that they can sell for $500 and $400, and not be laughed out of the room when they bring in that part to do so. And I think this is going to be a high performance part. It's a high end part. It's not going to be low end. When you think of a Phenom today, you're topping out at like a $200 part, which is great for most of our listeners and most of our viewers in terms of what they're actually going to build. But it's important for a company to have a flagship product, something they can stand on, on high on a chair and say, this is what we've done, this is what we have, and then all of the other Halo products around it get lifted a little bit because of it. So that is what is going on at Hot Chips. A lot of architectural discussions on things like that. So
I gotta ask, I'm looking over here, Xbox CPU GPU combo details. Is this a part that we're going to see somewhere outside of the Xbox, or is this going to be an Xbox exclusive chip?
This is really going to be only in the Xbox, the new Xbox S or Slim or whatever you want to call it. Because, and the reason we can say that is it's not, the original architecture of the Xbox was a 3-core hyper-threaded PowerPC processor, and then it had an ATI designed graphics core with a very unique implementation of memory. You had 10 megs of DRAM directly on the package, not on the chip, but on the package that it uses kind of like a high-speed data cache before buffer or before main system memory and that kind of thing. So the new 360 chip is essentially taking those two architectures and gluing them together into the same die. And it's quite literally doing that almost because there was a front-side bus. So in the original design, there was a front-side bus between the processor and the graphics card or the graphics core. When you combine these, you have one of the advantages of combining these two chips together is that you don't have any of that front-side bus requirement anymore. You don't have any of that latency. You have much higher bandwidth, and thus you have the potential for a much higher performance part because the communications are going on so much faster. However, Microsoft didn't want that to be the case. They didn't want to have one Xbox out that was significantly faster than the other Xbox. But I think more because of they didn't want to have publishers maybe start targeting a different design or something like that, or a different spec and start building games in a different way. They basically wanted to make sure all their platforms were the same in terms of physical hardware specifications and speeds and that type of thing. I would say, well, actually what they had to do was then they introduced a front side bus like replacement. Basically, there's a section of the silicon that basically slows down communications between the processor and the graphics core to emulate that latency because they didn't want anybody to be able to speed this thing up.
Oh, dude, if you buy the new Xbox, you can totally frag everybody because you can, that would be...
Yeah, that's what they did not want to happen. I'm personally disappointed by it. I thought it would have been cool to have an Xbox faster. I mean, you think how long has the Xbox 360 been out? 5 years or so?
The problem is that you end up you end up with like 90% of the Xbox. Let's say they're still selling a lot of Xboxes. You still end up at the end of the first year of the new Xbox, you still end up with maybe 15% of the entire Xbox market can run the faster versions of the software or the high performance version of the games. So the developers aren't actually going to write anything that takes advantage of the faster hardware. I mean, I Look, I love faster as much as you do, but I think in this case it makes a lot of sense to kind of choke everything down to the same performance level. The same level of mediocrity, which is why we should all sell our consoles and move to PC games.
I mean, I think you're right. It does make sense. I would say from an architectural standpoint, it's just interesting that we're just now getting into the world of CPU GPU hybrids from Intel and AMD for desktop PCs, and that this is one of the first implementations for it. Now, they did it mostly for power savings. They did it for cost savings. They save a lot of money this way. They can save power. They can cut down on the number of returns and repairs they have because their systems aren't dying as much, at least in theory, which is always a good sign. So, that's they're calling it. Well, I'm trying to the name of the chip they call it is VEJLE, Vela. I'm going to go with. I don't know. So that's what's going on in the world of the Xbox. Now, something else I'll get into real quick about graphics before we touch on some interesting Steam news is this little baby, this little graphics card. I've talked about.
So twee.
I know, compared to all the other cards you might have seen me hold up in recent months, this is kind of small. This is a palette GTX 460 graphics card using the NVIDIA GTX 460 GPU. And we've talked about that graphics card a lot on here. It's a great card. $200 to $230 is the normal price for them. It's a really good mid-range card, offers a lot of performance, somewhat modest power consumption, very efficient compared to the other NVIDIA parts that have been out. What's interesting about this card is it is highly overclocked out of the box. The standard 460s run at 675 megahertz. This one runs at 800 megahertz. Shader clocks go from 1350 to 1600. So we're talking, 18% or so clock speed increases right out of the box. And those translate directly into real world gaming results. Frame rate increases of anywhere from 15 to 18 to 20%, depending on the application.
Does that put it in 470 territory?
It very much does. In fact, this card we run through 7 or 8 tests was as fast as or faster than our reference speed GTX 470, our base speed GTX 470 in every game except one, and that game was Metro 2033, which is kind of like the beast of games that we always have now. And it was significantly slower in that game, like 50% slower at the image quality settings that we were using at. And the reason for that is the GF104 chip that is the GTX 460 has about 50% fewer tessellation units than the GF100 found in the GTX 470 and the GTX 480.
And what's a tessellation unit do?
A tessellation unit is part of the architecture that it was introduced with DirectX 11 that permits geometry to be created on the fly through the GPU as opposed to by hand by the artist during game creation. So the settings we were using in Metro 2033 use a lot of tessellation. So that is, for instance, why you'd see that. Also, expect Lost Planet 2, which is going to be a game I'm told uses a lot of tessellation. That will also be it will show a difference between the 470 and the 460. But for most DX9, DX10 games, this overclock card is going to cost you about $50 less than the cheapest GTX 470, but offer basically identical performance in those games. So,
is that for the? Is it? I assume it comes at a premium over a non-overclocked 460.
It does actually, but not by a significant amount. I was kind of surprised. It's $249 and it's a 1 gig model, and a base 1 gig card will cost you about $229, maybe $219. So you're talking about anywhere from $20 to $30 price difference, which really isn't a whole lot in the grand scheme of things when you're talking about actually getting 15 to 20% performance boost out of the card that you might not otherwise get. So very interesting.
That's and you don't have to go through the pain of overclocking a GPU yourself.
That's right. That's right.
And you get
warranty. You get warranty with it as well. So if it stops running at those clock speeds, you get to call them and say, "Hey, you need to replace this for me."
It broke. Fix it. So Steam has been out on a Mac OS 10 for how long?
I want to say it came out in early June, mid-June. It was released with, what was the main title? They released it with Portal. Yeah, the first Portal they released for free for Steam users. Let's see, it'll tell me here. It launched in May, I'm sorry. The middle of May 12th or so, it says it was launched. But this, I'm curious to see what you think about this. I think it's really interesting that apparently in July, Steam has these hardware surveys that come out every month. They're very, very interesting for people like us who pay attention to what hardware people are actually using, what they're buying, what they're moving and upgrading to. They showed that 5% of Steam users were running on Mac OS. And considering, let's see, this article at Joystick says that there are 25 million Steam users. So if you kind of extrapolate that out, we're talking about 1.25 million Steam Mac users already. I mean, do you think that's a significant type of turn?
Yeah, actually I do, because you think about, excuse me. So the Joystick article, if you guys haven't seen it, if you're Steam fans, you should check out the hardware and software survey that's linked off of that page, right? And they break down video card usage by manufacturer, Intel being 1.69% of all Steam users, DX10 versus DX11, Vista Win 7, PC processor usage by manufacturer, 72.37% Intel, 27.63% AMD, which actually I think is shows that there are a lot of gamers love AMD. Number of CPUs for computer, Mac hardware ownership, right? So 5% of the Mac hardware, or the 5% of Steam users are running OS 10, down from 8%, excuse me, 5% of Steam users are running Mac OS 10 systems, down from 8% in June, which was when they were doing the free Portal giveaway. But 47% of the Mac users running Steam are on a MacBook Pro, which at first sounds kind of ridiculous. Like, why are all these, Mac people gaming on notebooks? And it's because Mac desktops or Mac Pros are stupid expensive for what you get, and most people don't carry them. But still, Mac Pro is another, MacBook Pro 47%, MacBook 20%, Mac Pro 5.41%, and the ever so lowly Mac Mini at 3.4%. I'm actually kind of surprised I can run Steam. But it was interesting. I just thought it was kind of fascinating because it gave you this really amazing snapshot of what people are using, right? The largest the largest OS on Steam is Windows XP 32-bit. The average, or the largest number of users is 2 gigabytes of system RAM, 2 physical CPUs, ATI Radeon 4800 is like the most common GPU, but that's still less than, just a little over 7% of the user base. 1280 by 1024, 16%, almost 17% of the users are doing that. I think it's kind of fascinating, actually. I'm also if you think about, there's a lot of PC users that have moved to Mac and found Mac platform wanting as a gaming platform. Please don't send me hate mail, send it to Ryan. But that's, if you think about the majority of OS 10 users, I don't even think realize Steam exists yet. I think it's going to be interesting to see where it settles out at. And I would also be curious how many people tried to fire up, Portal on their Mac OS 10 MacBook, wanted to stab themselves in the face and then gave up on it, right? Not to slag on Intel graphics, but there's a reason less than 2% of the users on Steam are gaming with Intel graphics. So. Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. You kind of bring up that Windows to Mac thing. It's something I'm curious about. I wonder how many of those people are playing on both, or how many of them have it on Windows as well. But they, like me, I have Steam on several Windows PCs, but I also have it installed on my MacBook Pro, but only because I kind of wanted to try it and see how things work. And we did some testing and we talked about it on the show. I wonder how much overlap there is, people that have both, because I don't think they really break down which one it is that they're doing the hardware survey of. I don't know if Steam only does one primary system per user, or if they just pick a random system that the user's logged in at that time. Because remember, you can log into Steam anywhere, really. Do they pick the one that you're on the most often? I don't know how that really works.
I have no idea. I don't know.
I wonder if I'm counted as a Mac user on Steam or if I'm counted as a Windows user on Steam. That I don't know. So,
well, we can try to track down Steam PR and ask them.
Good luck. I've worked with Valve's guys quite a bit. When you get a hold of them, they got lots of good information. When you can't get a hold of them, don't keep trying. You put a link in here to another story that looked kind of interesting. We talk about storage and hard drives and SSDs a lot. And this is the first, I think we mentioned it a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago about the first 3 terabyte hard drive from Seagate. But this isn't an internal drive. It's actually an external unit.
Yeah, well, so Seagate, everybody figures 3 terabyte drives are not going to be out until November. That's the word on the street. 3 terabyte internal hard drives not out until November. A few weeks ago, Seagate releases a 3 terabyte drive, not an internal version, basically implemented in one of their GoDesk adapters. So you've talked about this in the past. It's basically the drive comes in a package, a cassette type thing. It plugs into a base. The base can be USB 3.0, USB 2.0, eSATA. You can basically mix and match bases and drives. And Nantech.com did a pretty in-depth review of the Seagate GoFlex Desk 3 terabyte, which is the first 3 terabyte drive on the market, in case I haven't said that enough. One of the interesting things it talks about is some of the issues you're going to have if you're thinking like, I've got the 3 terabyte drive. It's like I crack open the plastic case. Now I'm physically holding a 3 terabyte SATA drive from Seagate. And if you try to turn that into your boot drive, and I'm going to tell you to go to Nantech.com to read the article to find out the issues with that. But one of the things that I was kind of disappointed by is every time you have a jump in hard drive capacity, you tend to think either they added another platter or they increased the areal density, the amount of bits per square inch on the individual platter. And usually when you increase areal density, even if the drive's spinning at the same 7,200 RPM, because there's more bits per inch.
Right.
It's like a measurement of light bits. Anyhow, when you increase areal density, the side effect of that is for the same 7,200 RPM drive speed or 5,400 RPM drive speed, you move more bits underneath the head in the same revolution, which means you end up bringing up speeds, especially for sequential reads, not so much for non-sequential. And if I'm talking too fast, let me know. So one of the things that Anand said was I'll read you the line, not to get too far into the story.
Sure.
But 3 terabyte internal drive performance, quote, nothing to get excited about yet.
So. Yeah, one of the parts that I found interesting about this article and this product, I guess, was actually the first thing I thought about was, well, I'm going to rip this open and plug it into my computer. But apparently you can't just do that. No, it's basically the partitioning, it's the sector part. It's the sector translation that does really. It says he says Seagate offered clarification. Internally, the 3 terabyte drive uses 512 byte sectors. However, the GoFlex dock emulates a 4K drive to allow for a single 3 terabyte partition to be created in Windows. So that's kind of the issue. Is most Windows installations aren't going to allow partitions over 2 terabytes unless you have, unless you know what you're doing essentially. So. If you have a fairly late model motherboard, maybe with an Intel chipset that supports the GUID partition tables, you should, in theory, with updated firmware, be able to use this as a boot drive. Don't hold your breath, right? Because basically, like the motherboard boots up, it looks over the SATA connections and the IDE connections, it looks for the master boot record, LBA, logical block address 0, it finds it, it doesn't find it. It's kind of like trying to boot OS 10 on non-Apple machine motherboards. You got to go through some trickery to make it see what it wants to see so that it continues booting. So, yeah. And I think the speed differences weren't super impressive, but again, we're talking about external drive for the most part. Right. So as you said, good to get excited about more storage, but maybe not as excited as we'd hoped. Basically, I personally was hoping, wow, 3 terabytes. Imagine all the the areal density improvements and performance improvements we'll see for standard spindle drives, but apparently not the case yet. Well, who knows? Maybe they'll increase the density on the platters for the major release in November, and everything will change. I just want to be able to put 3 terabyte drives in my freaking Drobo. That's what I'm waiting for. Yes. Now, I personally am not a big cable. I'm not. I like to be a proponent of cleaning the inside of your case and sort of organizing cables and zip tying things up. And I think I always start out with the best of intentions when I build a new system. I'll zip tie things together and, tie them to the corners and create a nice little area. But what I tend to do is, as soon as I have to swap out a video card, or I need to take out a fan, or I need to move something to a different way, I start cutting those zip ties and never put them back together. That is what, that is unfortunately the methods that I go through. Now, you had a link in here to some premium cables, NZXT premium cables, and we don't really normally kind of talk about just like power supply cables and that type of thing. What stood out to you with these particular cables? Are they just longer, nicer, easier to route?
Well, I mean, something that caught my eye recently, I motherboard, the original Asus motherboard died in a Blackbird machine I ended up inheriting from somebody, one of those big 75-pound cases from HP. And one of the interesting things is, as I was trying to isolate everything, because you kind of assume, oh, it must be this connection, oh, it must be that connection. It couldn't be the dead motherboard until you look it up on Newegg and find like a 50% of like 1,400 consumers on Newegg rate this motherboard 1 star because it was DOA or died soon after they started running it. Then you know that maybe Asus had some problems with that motherboard. But one of the things I was fascinated by, I was looking at the way they laid out the cabling inside this case, right? It's a $4,000 computer. The least they can do is make the wires they hide them as much as possible. And in doing home theater installations lately, one of the things I've really gotten excited about was finding a local source, and not to take anything away from monoprice.com, but basically where I could get anywhere from 6-inch to 6-foot and longer HDMI cables, because then you don't end up with big amounts of cables dragging behind your home theater installation. You don't have to sit around with zip ties and tie things up. So NZXT actually was doing a premium cable review, or I should say thinkcomputers.org, was doing a review of NZXT cables. And what they did was basically talking about, okay, they're not going to really review the colors, but talking about what they were able to do in terms of cleaning up the case installation and dealing with like sleeved cables. Because do you remember the day like when sleeved cables started to be a really big thing, and people would sit with a razor blade and cut an IDE cable, in between the plastic on every single thread, and then they would bundle them together with zip ties or duct tape, or if they were really insane, they would figure out a way to sort of like shrink wrap sections of it down. But I thought it was something to talk about. It'd be fun, like, if when you're thinking about you're spending $1,200 on parts for a PC, maybe spend another $20-30 on cables to make it as easy as possible to lay out, because there's nothing worse, like you get the eSATA cable in the box and it's either like 3 feet long, right, and you end up like tripling it over and zip tying it in place, and then it kind of dangles inside the computer. And if you carry a computer to a LAN party, maybe it pulls out because the SATA connectors crap. Sorry. eSATA is the worst. eSATA is the worst external connection. Like USB 3.0 will succeed because eSATA is such a horrible connection for an external cable. Love the speed, love the performance, hate the physical cable connection. It's miserable. But I'm thinking, like, you're spending like $1,200 on parts. Even if you're spending $600 on parts, spend a little bit extra and get some cables so you can basically keep the airflow as clean as possible, keep the layout inside the case as neat as possible, and also, I got to throw some props to Think Computers. Like anytime somebody wants to sit down and review something fairly obscure, whether it's keyboards or cables, I just like to draw attention to that, because you know what, little things can make a huge difference in the look of your PC or the performance of your PC, or in terms of the performance of you integrating with or interacting with your PC. You know what I mean? Like, people don't think about all too often keyboards and monitors, and keyboard, monitor, and mouse are the 3 things that most dramatically impact your use of your computer every single time you sit down with it.
I've changed my keyboard more than any other component in any of my computers. If I have a keyboard I don't like, it's gone the next day, that type of thing. And monitors are the things that you usually keep the longest as well with our computers. So yes, very, very good points. We've got one more little news story to talk about here. We often get questions about power supplies and quiet computers. And here's an instance where we can combine these two topics and really talk about something that's good for both. Recently at PC Perspective, our own Lee Garbett did a review of a, what was the brand on it? It was a 400 watt Seasonic power supply.
X-400.
And the important part here is that it is completely fanless. So you have no fan noise. You don't have anything like that to worry about, which is good. Now, what's interesting when you read this review of this power supply, there are very specific instructions on how to install it, that you need to have a good airflow in your system. Otherwise, large case fans at the front and the back. Obviously, you can't just have, it basically says this side up, and it's very adamant about that. This side has to have airflow. If you put this down, if you mount this upside down, you will fry your power supply, and with it, maybe some other components in your system. So that's always good. Now, let's see. There was a Silent PC review roundup, I guess, of sorts.
Yeah. A torture test roundup. The Silent PC review guys basically threw all of these into their hot box, which is a 60 degrees Celsius room, which is 140. I looked it up. I still can't translate Fahrenheit to Celsius or Celsius to Fahrenheit. That's a 140 degree room. So that's an absolutely abusive. I mean, torture test is absolutely and utterly. Yeah, that's a worst case. That's a locked closet in like Nevada, in southern Nevada in August, locked closet, no AC, no swamp cooler. And like you pointed out, Seasonic's kind of set the standard for this. And before we go any farther than this, 400 watt power supply, what do you think the max in terms of a CPU GPU combination for a 400 watt power supply is? Could you run a Core i7 and a decent GPU on that?
I would say yes. If you look at, I was, for example, if you don't have a whole lot of accessories in there, I ran that GTX 460, the overclocked GTX 460, plus a Core i7 965, which is a really high-end quad-core hyper-threaded processor. And under a full gaming load, I was up to about 339 watts, so 340 watts. And I'd say that's about the maximum you want to draw on a system with a 400 watt power supply. You don't want to really judge your system and go to that 400 watt number if you can help it. So I mean you can't get a GTX 480 in there, and I wouldn't recommend a GTX 470 or 5870 from ATI or anything like that. But if you get one of these $200 graphics cards, whether that be the GTX 460, the 5830, and then you can go with a high-end Core i7, and you can save yourself 10 or 20 watts if you go with a Core i5 or maybe one of the 1156 socket Core i7. So I think you can actually build. I think people will be surprised when they figure out what kind of computer they can build with 400 watts, because we're so used to 1,000 watt and 1,200 watt power supplies these days.
Right. That's what everybody's talking about. So
right.
The roundup was the sort of I think the EIC for pretty much everybody's touch fanless PSUs is that Seasonic X400. They also tested the Silverstone ST40NF, the Silent Max MX560 PEL01, CoolMax is CF480B, and the Silent X, SILEN capital X, Luxury spelled with an AE because that's all marketing, 460. And yeah, some of them didn't do so well compared to the Seasonic.
I like if you go to the last page and you look up the balance sheet, the bottom one, the Silent X Luxury 460, the only positive it has is didn't blow up. So that's good. It had poor electrical performance, poor efficiency, it ran too hot, screw holes that can't be used, and it's a ridiculously high $240 MSRP, especially if you consider that the Seasonic X400 is about $140. That's still pretty high for a 400 watt power supply, but they're using the best components possible that are going to last the longest under the most sustained heat with these fanless units. So
yeah, well, I mean, the Seasonic, right? It's 90% efficient. It comes with a 5-year warranty, all modular cables. And oh yes, they put it in a 140 degree room for 15 hours with no overheating and no failure. I'm impressed. I'm officially impressed with that.
Yeah.
And given what some of the crappy power supplies I've bought for, because I mean, like I would never buy a crappy power supply intentionally, but once in a while you get to the central computer and they have like that brand of power supply, and it's a choice between building the system.
I understand.
And using the crap power supply or not building the system. But
yeah, that's like me when it's anytime I'm forced to run to Best Buy for a PC component, I always know I'm going to replace it in a couple of weeks when I think about it and I'm on Newegg buying something else anyway. But you do what you can do.
It's a write-off, man. So Silent PC Review, awesome roundup if you're looking for a quiet PC. You had an email from Brian about desktop switchable graphics, which is something I absolutely love about a certain Alienware notebook.
Yeah, so Brian wrote in, and he says he always hears about the laptop switchable graphics, but he hasn't found any information for desktops. Our family's computer is always on due to the kids playing on it or the need to run Magic Jack. I guess that's a good point. If that's your phone system, you always have to have that on. So it says our GeForce graphics card is only used maybe once a month for minor gaming. Is there any option out there that would either allow us to switch to our built-in Intel motherboard graphics and then back to the GeForce when needed? Or is there another switchable option that we could save some energy or heat with? So switchable graphics on the notebook side, a fairly recent revelation to have really good switchable graphics that's kind of automatic and you don't have to reboot between that type of stuff. Nothing really exists like that for the desktop today. Right. In terms of your general consumer products.
Well, it's in a notebook, right? I switched to the Intel graphics on an Alienware F11X. I double the battery life. You know what I mean? And if I switch from the Intel onboard graphics to the discrete graphics in that, I get a huge jump in gaming performance. But you're talking about literally about going from, I want to say 4 to 8 hours, 4.5 to almost 10 hours of battery life by dropping, going away from, it's pretty close to doubling. I think our real world is closer to 6 or 7 hours battery life, but you're basically talking about just giving yourself a huge performance boost. And the flip side of that is like, look, everybody wants to save energy. I'm all about saving energy. I want to be green, but 40 watts ends up being about $4 or $5 a year here in San Francisco. If you charge yourself the most expensive per kilowatt hour time of day and pretend that charge runs 24 hours, even though it actually drops in the evening and comes back up during peak usage hours, maybe your electricity is a lot more expensive, and it's a cumulative, we go from incandescent bulb to CF bulbs or LED bulbs, and over the life of the house you end up in theory consuming fewer bulbs and consuming less electricity. There's just, most motherboard manufacturers are probably going, so I add the incredible expensive onboard graphics, or because the majority of people who purchase motherboards with onboard graphics never actually have discrete graphics, any kind of high performance gaming graphics. Right. So there's not a whole lot of, you're going to save yourself X number of watts if you increase the cost of the system and you do additional programming in the BIOS. I just don't think the benefit's there. I don't think any of the motherboard manufacturers are looking around going, gosh, we're going to be so much more successful if we offer the ability to, have a green mode that shuts down the
It's a lot more complicated of a process on a desktop as well, because you have easily swappable components. So you'd have to really limit the selection of hardware. On the notebook, it's a function of the graphics and driver. It's very specific on what bus technologies it will work on, which platforms it will work on, that kind of stuff. They don't have a lot of control with that on the desktop world. And also, you said 40 watts. I would bet these graphics cards at idle might even be pulling less than. I didn't say which GeForce graphics card he's using, but I mean, I don't think it's a considerable amount for anybody to really be worrying about at this point. As long as you have it, if it's spinning down, if it's not, you don't hear the fans buzzing or something like that, like a driver is broken or something, and that's keeping it running at full speed the whole time, I think you'll be okay.
Yeah, I'm also, the thing that occurred to me is, can you imagine trying to set up every motherboard so that, because, notebooks, they have a single DVI output or a single VGA output. Imagine trying to re-architect the PCI Express bus so that you could reroute the graphics from the, either from the onboard and out through the PCI Express to the port on the back of the graphics card, or you would have to have a discrete piece of external hardware that, automatically switched between the two DVI outputs, the one on the motherboard and the one on the graphics card. It's a mess. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Alex
J. Nath at Ryan Shrout. What do you guys think of the new Commodore 64?
Did you look at this?
No. It's kind of like the Amiga. It's like, oh, so that's nice.
This is really just somebody rebuilding the Commodore 64 as a case for an Atom-based PC. So this is, you can see it's got a compact flash adapter and stuff on the front. But I remember this was kind of a big deal when this company bought the name, right? Because I think originally they were going to make like a full-size desktop computer. It was going to compete against the Alienwares and the Falcons and the Puget Systems and these guys in terms of building, like making Commodore kind of like an enthusiast brand again, which I thought would have been pretty cool. I think it would have been a tough task to undertake either way. But now it seems
if you were like young in the 80s, Commodore has a certain, something.
Yeah, it's let's see the computer Commodore USA online store set to open June 1st. So that should have been already actually. It was just kind of an interesting little thing. I think it would be more fun if somebody were to send in, hey, you know what? I had an old Commodore 64 and I rebuilt it and I put in a small form factor motherboard with an Atom processor and blah, 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 blah. And it's actually the original one because they're obviously rebuilding and remanufacturing things. It's got the optical disk drive on the side and that kind of stuff. It's kind of cool. I would imagine they'll be more expensive than I'll ever want to pay for the hardware that's inside of it. But hey, it's one of those nifty little things. Would have wanted to thank Alex for pointing that out.
Yeah, if you are looking for a PC built into a keyboard, I think, I think this is CommodoreUSA.net is officially the world leader in computers built into keyboards at this point. If they ever start selling them.
Asus was supposed to have had the Asus E keyboard, like how they have the EPC. Right. They did have an E keyboard. I don't know if they ever came for sale. It's available for pre-order on Amazon. I have no idea if it ever shipped. It was kind of cool. It was a keyboard with an Atom PC inside of it, but instead of the number pad, it was going to have a small kind of iPhone-sized touch screen on that right-hand panel of it, which would be pretty cool. But I don't know if it ever. No, it is in stock. You can buy them on Amazon apparently. $550 for an Asus E keyboard.
Oh no!
It had a lot of potential, right? It had an ultra wideband built-in transmitter and an external receiver, so you could maybe push out it's basically like external HDMI, right?
Right.
Essentially. So, they had a lot of good ideas in it, but I don't think it panned out as well as they'd hoped. And really, an Atom N270 single core processor, not the best thing to power that by. So
that Commodore USA computer that they're showing, the silver one, is actually the ZPC GX31, which has been floating around for a while. It's like $1,000, $1,100. It's been floating around since 2008.
Ouch.
Yeah, Cybernet, I think, was the original manufacturer. Cybernet, man.
We got another Twitter question from Blitzkrieger, who says, any chance you could recommend a great low-profile ATI video card for light gaming along the lines of Guild Wars, Half-Life 2, Portal, or Portal 2 eventually? I did some digging at our favorite online retailer and basically went to kind of filter down. I went to ATI and I went to one of the selections comes with a half-height mounting bracket. That's how you'll know it's a low-profile card if it also comes with that low-profile bracket. And basically I went to sort by highest price, looked at the top models, and picked what I think is the fastest card available in this profile. It's a Radeon HD 5570 1 gig card. It's a 5500 series card, so it's not going to be incredibly fast. It's not going to blow you away in terms of gaming performance. Those particular game titles that he mentioned, Guild Wars, Half-Life 2, Portal 2, I'm not 100% sure on. Obviously, he says it's not out. But the first three, I can tell you that this will play it at 1080p resolutions. Might not be able to max out all the image quality settings, but you'll be able to play it. And it's $89 for the card too. So depending on what his budget was, I mean, like I literally looked for the most expensive cards and started looking through them and going, which ones are the best performers here as well. And this is kind of at the top of the list. There are some 4000 series cards available still, but with 5000, you just get additional features and this kind of stuff. So you got a low profile ready. It's actually the one I picked out was from Sapphire, the Sapphire Radeon HD 5570, 1 gig, low profile. Do searches around Newegg or Amazon. I'm sure you'll find that particular card or another one very similar. But nothing higher performance than that was available in low profile from either NVIDIA or ATI at this point. So limitations of board design, PCB design, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the smaller the computer, the less likely you are to have graphics that plays the latest games.
Indeed, indeed. So it looks like that's going to wrap up our show for today. If you want to submit questions for Patrick and I, if you've got questions about what upgrades you should be taking, what's our favorite power supply, what's our favorite memory, graphics card for any particular situation, you can get a hold of us in at least a number of ways. First is on Twitter. Patrick is at Patrick Norton. I am at Ryan Shrout. Pretty simple there. We make it easy for you. No nicknames, no letters instead of or no numbers instead of letters or anything like that. You can also email me, ryan@twit.tv. And Patrick, do you have an email address as well?
Sure. I will actually probably just patrick@revision3.com would be the best one. Or slamdance@gmail.com. That way it gets more spam coming into it. The spam's been down on that account, so let's get the email address out there and get the spam.
There you go.
posted.
You got to start writing it in all kinds of web posts. That'll get the job done if you want to do that. This Week in Computer Hardware is the name of the show. You can find us at twit.tv/twitch, TWICH. There's no extra T in there. We record the show live every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific at live.twit.tv. And Patrick, where else can we find you and your workings, what you dive into in terms of technology?
I get my geek on at techzilla.com. Techzilla.com? Well, revision3.com/techzilla, TEKZILLA. Me and Veronica Belmont every week getting our geek on. And with Robert Heron, I do HD Nation. If you love home theater gear and high definition content, I highly recommend you check out revision3.com/HD Nation. It's fun. And we've broke out my new AV receiver this week on the show, which shows up on Monday. It's amazing what $350 buys now. It is freaking phenomenal.
That is the one part of my system that I have not upgraded in many, many years. It's probably been 6 or 7 years since I've upgraded any kind of audio in my system. That will probably be the next thing. I'll have to check out that episode this week. You can find me at PC Perspective, which is a hardware review website. We do news and coverage of the latest hardware and all this kind of stuff. PCper.com is where you find that for my articles and a lot of other very intelligent people doing writings on a daily basis. So with that, we will end the show. We will see you next week. It's been This Week in Computer Hardware. Thanks.